You're the royal physician, summoned deep into the corridors of Madrid's royal palace. The year is 1834. The king is dead, but your duties are far from over. A strange request awaits you.
So unsettling, so grotesque.
You begin to doubt your own grip on reality. Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands before you, eyes rimmed with tears, and gives you a command that sends ice through your spine. Your hands tremble as you near the deathbed. A Ferdinand VII. Even in death, the man who ruled Spain with cruelty and suspicion seems to sneer from beyond the grave. But it isn't his face that holds your gaze. It's what lies beneath the silk sheets, the thing that defined his reign. As much as his brutality, his paranoia, or his endless betrayals, a grotesque anatomical deformity, a bizarrely shaped, unnaturally large organ, that would live on in rumor, not record. Ferdinand VI's monstrous endowment, a source of twisted pride and unbearable shame, whispered about by historians for generations, but never officially written down. As you begin the preservation, your thoughts drift to the whispers you've heard echoing through palace halls, tales of strange cushions, of screaming queens, and the desperate, painful efforts to produce an heir, all in defiance of a cruel trick played by nature itself. In this moment, you realize you're not just preserving flesh and bone, you're preserving a symbol, the physical reflection of a reign that was deformed, grotesquely overgrown, and ultimately ruinous to everything it touched. But before we dive into these buried stories of pain, control, and survival, if you find value in uncovering the hidden corners of history, consider tapping the like button and subscribing. It helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's a powerful thought that across continents and time zones, we gather here, connected by our shared hunger, to understand the shadows of the past. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must begin with the curse he carried, not cast by witches or gods, but by the twisted legacy of royal blood. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had tangled their family trees, cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedded to nieces, creating a genetic time bomb. It detonated slowly, manifesting in fragile minds, disfigured bodies, and rulers unfit to wear the crown. Ferdinand was the grotesque result. Born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a union itself forged between first cousins. The genetic dice had been loaded long before his birth, and Ferdinand would pay for it, in the most personal and most humiliating way imaginable. As he grew from boy to adolescent, it became disturbingly clear nature had played a cruel, almost surreal joke on the future king of Spain. Ferdinand's anatomy began to develop in a way that defied logic, a grotesque abnormality that puzzled even seasoned physicians. By his teenage years, rumors whispered through palace corridors of a royal deformity so extreme, it bordered on the unthinkable, an appendage so massive, so strangely shaped, it seemed otherworldly. Hidden for centuries within sealed Vatican records, medical reports described his condition in unsettling detail. One physician noted, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form, that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was more direct. "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at the base, thick as a man's fist at the extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological toll on young Ferdinand was immense. In an age when male anatomy was idealized by classical Greek standards, where smaller meant refinement, restraint, even nobility, Ferdinand's grotesque size marked him as a grotesque anomaly. What modern men might covet became a source of lifelong shame. For Spain's future king, his childhood was a slow-burning crucible of dysfunction, the kind that doesn't break a man, but warps him into something far worse. His father, Charles IV, was feeble and disinterested, a monarch more devoted to hunting than governance. His mother, Maria Luisa, was infamous for her ravenous desires, publicly entangled with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's shadow ruler in all but name. Young Ferdinand watched it all, the humiliation, the betrayal, the collapse of trust, and absorbed a twisted education in power. But it was his own grotesque physicality that carved the deepest scars. Palace halls echoed with whispers, servants giggled behind closed doors, courtiers dropped veiled comments. Even foreign envoys sent discreet reports about the Spanish prince with the monstrous flaw. Ferdinand learned early that he was a joke, a punchline cloaked in silk and titles. The shame festered, and eventually bled into how he ruled Spain itself. He began seeing mockery in every bow, every tutor's polished phrase, every bride's stiff smile. And he wasn't entirely wrong. They were laughing, just not always for the reasons he feared. The prince's tutors began observing a chilling change. As adolescence crept in, he turned inward, vengeful, and disturbingly harsh toward anyone below his station. Servants who erred weren't simply let go. They were broken, even erased. Ferdinand had found a grim consolation. He could wield royal authority, to hide the torment his own body inflicted on him. He couldn't fix the monstrous deformity he'd been cursed with, but he could dominate those around him. One chilling episode survives. In the diary of a palace chaplain, who documented the moment cruelty became instinct, page boy, still a child, unintentionally caught sight of the undressed prince. What followed wasn't punishment, it was a lesson. Ferdinand didn't forgive or forget. He made the boy carry the shame for both of them. He had the boy publicly flogged, and his entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one glimpsed the prince's secret and walked away untouched. As Ferdinand neared the age of matrimony, his physical burden became impossible to ignore. Royal physicians, summoned in secrecy, began to grasp the true scope of the problem. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's own physician, left behind confidential notes, a deeply unsettling record of what lay beneath royal robes. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, exhibits a most unnatural configuration. The base is no wider than a man's thumb, yet it swells into a circumference, so extreme it challenges what nature permits. Its length, he recorded, exceeded that of any known human specimen, measuring nearly 10 inches at rest, and expanding even further when aroused. But most alarming was the strange curvature, and the presence of excess tissue, growths that served no clear biological purpose. The implications for Ferdinand's future as a husband, let alone a father, were obvious. Ordinary intimacy would be impossible, without serious medical intervention, and equipment no typical physician could provide. Behind palace doors, royal craftsmen were summoned in secret to build what they politely labeled marital aids, custom-made cushions and intricate supports. These devices were designed to let Ferdinand perform sexually, without seriously injuring his future queens. But the physical struggle was only part of the torment. His condition had psychological effects that reached far beyond the bedchamber. He became obsessed with potions and elixirs, anything that promised to correct his form or increase his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were smuggled into Madrid under strict secrecy, each promising miracle cures that always ended in failure. The prince spent fortunes on these false hopes, drinking mixtures of ground rhino horn, powdered pearls, and exotic herbs, meant to stabilize his royal essence. Some promised to reduce the size of his member. Others claimed to boost virility despite its shape. None worked, but Ferdinand's desperation made him easy prey for con men and quacks. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia, of Naples and Sicily. The union had been arranged when both were still teenagers. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with starry-eyed dreams about her future husband. She'd heard he was called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters, and pictured herself marrying a storybook prince. The wedding was spectacular, a dazzling spectacle of dynastic glory. The cathedral thundered with music, and Madrid streets overflowed with celebration. The young couple looked every inch the ideal royal match. Maria Antonia was radiant, sharp, beautiful, and genuinely thrilled for the life awaiting her. Ferdinand, for once, appeared almost normal in public, polished, attentive, even tender. But royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first shadow fell when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with a strange request. Unusual preparations were required for the royal bedchamber, with equipment the women didn't understand. But they were assured that such arrangements were customary for royal couples. Custom-made cushions were brought in, alongside bottles of oils, salves, and a curious array of instruments that felt more medical than marital. Maria Antonia, naive and sheltered, like most royal brides of her age, understood none of it. Her upbringing had been devout and delicate, centered around languages, music, and proper courtly manners. The truths of married life had been whispered to her, in the vaguest of terms, by anxious older women, who themselves had no knowledge of the specific horrors awaiting her. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia's first glimpse of her husband's unclothed form threw her into a fit of hysteria. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, recounted the moment. Her Majesty screamed, as if the devil himself had entered the room. She pressed against the wall, crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had gone mad. Ferdinand's infamous member, described as a grotesque club, with a thin, stick-like base, was unlike anything the innocent princess had imagined possible. It wasn't just the size that terrified her, it was the shape, the way it curved and twisted unnaturally, the strange, lumpy growths along its length, the almost alien appearance of the entire organ. That's what truly shattered her composure. What followed that night was no romantic consummation. It was a medical ordeal. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians were summoned to explain to the trembling princess what her duties would entail. Custom cushions were positioned, oils carefully applied, and what began was more surgical procedure than act of love. Private letters exchanged between royal physicians paint a scene of surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy required a special support cushion to hold its weight, to prevent harm to himself during intercourse. Even with all these preparations, the experience proved so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she had to be given laudanum just to endure it. The psychological scars left on both husband and wife were immediate and profound. Ferdinand, already drowning in paranoia and insecurity, spiraled deeper into darkness. As his wife's revulsion became undeniable, Maria Antonia, in turn, descended into what modern psychologists would recognize as profound sexual trauma. She began taking laudanum in ever-increasing doses, slowly becoming addicted, using the drug to escape the nightmare of her wifely obligations. Their attempts to conceive an heir turned into a grim, ritualized ordeal, repeating with tragic regularity. Ferdinand would summon his doctors, who would ready the bedchamber with its strange tools and cushions. Maria Antonia, pale and trembling, would be sedated with just enough laudanum to keep her compliant, but not unconscious. The ordeal was carried out with cold, clinical precision. Afterward, both husband and wife would retreat to separate wings of the palace, each left to recover from the trauma in silence. As months slipped into years, with no heir to show for it, Ferdinand's desperation turned manic. He convinced himself that Maria Antonia's visible disgust was somehow blocking conception, a failure born of feminine weakness. So he escalated. Court records show that Ferdinand commissioned specially designed restraints meant to hold the queen in place during their private sessions, strapping her down so she couldn't recoil, couldn't resist, couldn't even look away. These restraints, made of leather and silk, were crafted by the same royal artisans who fashioned his saddles and hunting gear, adding a chilling new purpose to the king's beloved workshop. The king soon became obsessed with timing their encounters to match astrological alignments and lunar cycles. He turned to astronomers, astrologers, even occultists, anyone who claimed they could bend the stars toward royal conception. The palace turned into a sanctuary for frauds and mystics, hawking fertility potions, magical charms, and elaborate rituals to counter the curse of Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy. One desperate episode saw him consulting a wandering mystic said to hail from the east. This so-called sage told Ferdinand his deformity was no curse, it was divine, the dragon's rod he called it, and with the right rituals, his full power would awaken. For 3 months, Ferdinand and Maria Antonia endured strange ceremonies, filled with incense, chanting, and contortions said to come from ancient Chinese scrolls. Astonishingly, twice Maria Antonia conceived. The court exploded in celebration. Ferdinand brimmed with new confidence, and Spain dared to hope. But both pregnancies ended in miscarriage, leaving the royal couple more broken than they had ever been. The first miscarriage came in 1804. For months into the pregnancy, court physicians blamed it on the strain placed upon Her Majesty's delicate health. But the truth, never spoken aloud, was far more harrowing. Ferdinand's anatomical deformity made their encounters so brutal, so physiologically traumatic, that her body simply couldn't carry a child to term. Then came 1805, and a second, more devastating loss. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to full term, but the labor, agonizing and drenched in blood, nearly killed her. She survived, barely, but she was never the same. Her dependence on laudanum spiraled, and she drifted through her final 2 years as a pale, glass-eyed ghost. And Ferdinand, rather than offer compassion or sorrow, his reaction revealed something far darker, a glimpse into the full depth of his cruelty and self-obsession. Ferdinand became convinced that Maria Antonia was sabotaging their chances. He accused her of secretly taking substances to prevent pregnancy, of moving in ways that might cause a miscarriage, even of harboring liberal sympathies that made her unfit to bear a proper Catholic heir. These whispered accusations echoed through the palace halls, slowly shattering what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental stability. She began to believe she was cursed, that her body rejected Ferdinand's seed. As punishment for some unknown sin, her final months were a blur of frantic prayers and silent tears, begging forgiveness for crimes she had never committed. In May 1807, she died just 21 years old. The official cause, fever and the fragility of her constitution. But the truth was darker. Maria Antonia had died of despair, her body ravaged by trauma, her mind hollowed by addiction and abuse. Even in death, Ferdinand's paranoia clung to her name. Rumors swirled, not of assassins or rivals, but of a husband who may have poisoned her himself, tired of her failures, and ready to begin again, one who might finally give him the heir he craved. Whispers of foul play only grew louder. After the palace apothecary was found dead, just days after Maria Antonia's passing, he left behind a cryptic letter, but it vanished, seized immediately by Ferdinand's agents, and never seen again. Some claimed it held a confession, a list of poisons administered to the queen. Others believed it revealed the truth about Ferdinand's grotesque condition and the unbearable expectations forced upon his wife. Ferdinand's behavior after her death only deepened the suspicion. Though he displayed all the public signs of mourning, in private he seemed almost relieved. Within mere weeks, he began discreet inquiries for a new bride, specifically targeting women who had already borne children. This time he was taking no chances. His queen had to be proven fertile. The crown's survival, he believed, depended on it. The king's physicians, meanwhile, worked frantically on new treatments for his condition. If Ferdinand was to remarry, they had to find ways to make intimacy less horrifying. For his next bride, this gave rise to some of the most bizarre medical experiments in royal history. Doctors crafted increasingly complex marital devices and explored experimental surgeries to reshape Ferdinand's anatomy. As he neared his second marriage, his personality was already warping, revealing the twisted traits that would one day earn him a place among history's most reviled monarchs. The trauma of his first marriage, coupled with deep-rooted shame over his deformity, had forged a man incapable of love, empathy, or connection. Ferdinand no longer saw people as human beings, only as instruments for his satisfaction, or obstacles to be crushed. His first wife, in his mind, had simply malfunctioned, and like any broken object, she had to be thrown away. To Ferdinand, his subjects were nothing more than instruments, tools to preserve his rule, to prop up his ego. Anyone who challenged him was not a person, but an obstacle to be eliminated. At the palace, his cruelty began to surface. In subtle but chilling ways, he tested his power, with commands that were bizarre, pointless, and increasingly cruel. Servants who caught a glimpse of him unclothed weren't just dismissed, they vanished. Guards who let slip rumors about the royal chambers were banished to Spain's deadliest outposts, posted on the crumbling edges of the empire. Ferdinand grew consumed by the belief that laughter followed him through the halls, that whispers and snickers hid just beyond every door. He became obsessed with the idea that everyone, courtiers, cooks, even clergy, were mocking him in secret. And truth be told, his paranoia wasn't without basis. People were whispering rumors of his condition, spread through palace kitchens and noble drawing rooms alike. But Ferdinand's response wasn't measured, it was unhinged. He began keeping secret lists, names of those he suspected of laughing at him, and devised twisted revenge plots he vowed to unleash once he held the crown. By 1807, he was no longer just a prince. He was the nucleus of a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of Spain's aristocracy. Ambitious nobles and restless generals saw in Ferdinand a tool to topple the frail rule of Charles IV and his hated minister, Manuel de Godoy. What they didn't yet grasp was that this tool had a hairline crack, a fracture carved by sexual torment, and festering insecurity. The conspirators, calling themselves the Fernandinos, hailed him as El Deseado, the desired one. They flooded the streets with praise of his brilliance, his courage, his promise to restore Spain's lost glory. What they kept hidden was their growing fear that Ferdinand might be far more unstable than the regime they hoped to destroy. The conspiracy finally erupted in October 1807, what became known as the El Escorial affair, where Ferdinand was caught secretly plotting to overthrow his own father, with none other than Napoleon Bonaparte's support. When the scheme unraveled, Ferdinand's reaction laid bare his true nature, a man without courage, without loyalty. Instead of defending those who had risked everything for him, he crumbled, naming names, giving up every detail, even begging his parents for mercy. While his allies were sent to prison or exile, Ferdinand slithered away unscathed. But the damage was done, and a pattern had begun. He would use people to climb, then cut them loose the moment they became inconvenient. Even as this political drama played out, his personal afflictions worsened. Royal physicians recorded with alarm that his anatomy was still changing, growing larger, more misshapen, with strange new abnormalities that made intimacy increasingly impossible. Some modern medical experts believe Ferdinand may have suffered from a rare condition, megalophilus, a hormonal disorder that causes uncontrolled growth of the male organ well into adulthood. Whatever the medical diagnosis, the reality was unmistakable. Ferdinand would need more advanced tools and ever more submissive wives if he was to sire an heir. That grim truth led to one of the darkest aspects of his later marriages, the calculated choice of women, who could be either psychologically broken or physically forced into meeting his demands. Inside the palace, a strange evolution had taken place. Craftsmen once devoted to royal carriages and ceremonial armor, now specialized in building intricate marital contraptions. Their hidden workshops, buried deep beneath the palace floors, looked less like artisan studios and more like a cross between a surgical theater and a medieval torture chamber. They engineered adjustable cushions, restraints, and strange instruments each designed to make Ferdinand's couplings possible, while sparing his partners from the worst of the damage. These artisans were bound to silence, secured by bribes of gold on one hand, and whispered threats on the other. Yet silence has its price. Several of these craftsmen later turned up dead, under circumstances too suspicious to ignore, fueling rumors that Ferdinand had ordered their elimination, to ensure no one could ever reveal the truth about their grotesque creations. Then, in 1808, disaster struck. Napoleon's armies poured into Spain, and Ferdinand was forced to abdicate. The so-called desired one now found himself in the most degrading position imaginable, a king without a throne, a prisoner in foreign hands, and his captor almost certainly knew his most guarded secret. French intelligence kept meticulous dossiers on every European royal, and somewhere in those files was a detailed account of the anatomical curse that haunted Ferdinand's life. During Ferdinand's 6-year captivity at the Château de Valençay, his condition became a subject of fascination, not just to spies but to scientists, French physicians, unbound by the etiquette and deference that had silenced their Spanish counterparts, subjected the deposed monarch to a battery of medical tests, so invasive they bordered on clinical torture. The reports they compiled, buried in Napoleonic archives for centuries, would become the most detailed records of Ferdinand's affliction ever uncovered. They described a sexual organ so grotesquely large, so warped in shape and structure, that it seemed drawn from legend, more beast than man. The French theorized that his deformity was no single defect, but the collision of multiple genetic disorders, a perfect storm of hereditary malfunction, that had created a man cursed from birth. Meanwhile, word reached him of Spanish generals, fighting and dying to restore his throne. The irony was bitter. As patriots spilled blood in mountain passes and fetid trenches, their would-be king was consumed by only one thought, his next attempt at conception. From his chambers, Ferdinand penned letter after letter to European courts, searching for a bride who might tolerate his unique condition. These missives, in his own shaky hand, show not a hint of gratitude or grief for his suffering country. While Spain was being torn apart by war, Ferdinand was drafting plans for his next wedding night. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the welcome that met him defied imagination. Crowds surged through the streets, throwing flowers and sobbing with joy. Some fell to their knees as his carriage rolled by, hands raised in prayer as if witnessing a miracle. Children who had never seen a monarch watched in awe as the man their parents had died for finally appeared before them. Even the stones of Madrid seemed to echo with song. Ferdinand smiled, nodded, and waved like a conquering hero, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of rebuilding Spain, or thanking those who had bled for his return. His first concern was intensely personal, finding a new wife, one who might finally deliver the heir he had failed for so long to produce. His reappearance marked the dawn of what historians now call the ominous decade. But the real darkness wasn't just his political repression. It was how his obsession with fatherhood, driven by shame, dysfunction, and fear, began to corrupt every corner of the monarchy. For Ferdinand, sex and statecraft were now intertwined, two agonies feeding on each other. His very first act as restored king was to summon Europe's most skilled artisans, not to build monuments or weapons, but to design a new generation of marital instruments, more refined, more advanced, and more desperate than ever before. Ferdinand dispatched secret agents to Germany, Italy, even the Ottoman Empire, not for politics but for craftsmen, artisans known for building devices, to aid delicate royal needs. The devices they returned with were unlike anything the Spanish court had ever seen. Hidden deep within the palace, this strange collection became a monument, not to love or lineage, but to the darkest edges of royal desperation. By 1816, Ferdinand had chosen a new bride, Maria Isabel of Portugal, a cousin, of course, one more branch in the twisted tree of European dynasties. She was 19, soft-voiced, hopeful, carrying the same illusions countless princesses had before her. The court physicians had already warned her ladies-in-waiting about the unusual requirements of the king's private life, but no whispered briefing, no careful grooming, could prepare her for the grotesque ritual that awaited her. On her wedding night, the wedding ceremony was pure theater, a baroque spectacle, draped in silk, incense, and desperation. Ferdinand stood at the altar, wrapped in cloth of gold, his expression tight with barely hidden panic. For days, he had secluded himself, meeting not just with court physicians, but with alchemists, and a veiled stranger, whispered to be an Ottoman expert in royal difficulties, smuggled into Madrid under cover of night. But no magic, no device, no foreign expertise could change fate. The wedding night was a catastrophe, one so horrific it would leave scars on both bodies and minds. Despite all efforts, Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy remained unconquerable. The sounds that tore through the palace were not of passion, but screams of pain. Servants spoke in hushed tones of blood-soaked sheets, splintered furniture, and a bedchamber more akin to an inquisition than a royal honeymoon. Isabel never recovered. Her stutter appeared within days, a trembling in her voice that hadn't been there before. And whenever Ferdinand entered a room, she would visibly flinch. Soon she was suffering what doctors euphemistically called hysterical episodes, but what her doctors called hysteria, modern eyes would recognize as textbook trauma. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered of nights, punctuated by screams, Isabel waking in terror, crying out warnings about the monster that stalked her dreams. Ferdinand, of course, took none of this as a cry for help. To him, her fear wasn't sorrow, it was treason, an affront to his dignity. His already festering paranoia erupted. He became convinced that Isabel was working with foreign agents to humiliate him, to expose his secret. He ordered her letters intercepted, her meals tested for poison, her chambers searched for coded betrayals. What had begun as a physical dysfunction had now metastasized into political madness. The king's wounded pride, mutating into national psychosis. The pressure to produce an heir became an all-consuming obsession, not just for Ferdinand and Isabel, but for the entire Spanish court. The king summoned a parade of increasingly peculiar specialists, physicians, anatomists, even circus performers, who claimed to have experience with abnormal anatomy. The royal bedchamber transformed into a theater of sexual experimentation, a place where human dignity was routinely sacrificed in the name of dynastic duty. One harrowing account, found in the private journal of a court physician, describes Ferdinand's decision to invite foreign experts to witness his conjugal failures firsthand. German anatomists, French surgeons, all gathered to observe, to record, as the king turned his most intimate failures into a grotesque medical performance. Sketches were drawn, notes were taken, and soon, across Europe, Ferdinand's bedroom had become a case study in royal dysfunction. Isabel, paraded before this gallery of voyeurs and scholars, began to unravel. The signs of collapse were impossible to ignore. She stopped eating regularly, shed dangerous weight, and developed a vacant, thousand-yard stare that unsettled even the most hardened servants. What frightened them more than her screams was the eerie silence she carried with her. The young queen had become a ghost, wandering the corridors of a palace that now felt more like a prison. But Ferdinand's private failures could no longer be contained behind royal walls. Their consequences were spilling into the world outside. In Spain's American colonies, already burning with revolt, revolutionary leaders pointed to the king's inability to produce an heir as proof of divine judgment against the decaying Bourbon dynasty. Propaganda circulated through ports and cities, pamphlets depicting Ferdinand as a limp, broken tyrant, a man whose twisted body symbolized the crumbling state. He was no longer fit to rule. The king's most private humiliation had become a banner for revolution, a whispered symbol of decay. From the plazas of Mexico to the hills of Argentina, Ferdinand's response was true to form, paranoid, merciless, and drenched in fear. He launched another brutal wave of purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors or supporting rebellion. The Inquisition, resurrected by Ferdinand after his return, now investigated so-called sexual slander against the crown. Private jokes, even between husband and wife, could end in arrest, torture, or execution. His obsession with secrecy grew absurd. He ordered secret corridors built through the palace, so he could slip from his room to Isabel's without being seen. Mirrors were positioned at precise angles to catch lurking servants. A web of spies monitored whispers, tracking every rumor about the royal bedroom. Meanwhile, Isabel's body began to collapse under the weight of her husband's brutality. Physicians noted a new symptom, what they called phantom pregnancies, false signs of life, in a womb that would never carry one. She would show every sign of pregnancy, swelling, cravings, even morning sickness, despite the biological impossibility of conception. Each episode gave Ferdinand a fleeting spark of hope, snuffed out by the cruel truth that followed. The queen's phantom pregnancies became a macabre joke in a palace already poisoned by dysfunction. Servants whispered of the king, pacing outside her doors, swinging between prayer and profanity, as if a miracle might override the grotesque mechanics of his condition. It was a ritual of delusion, a monarch begging heaven to undo what nature had carved in flesh. The palace air grew heavier with each false alarm, and the line between pity and ridicule blurred beyond recognition. Ferdinand had turned his wife's suffering into theater, and even divine silence sounded like laughter in his ears. When each phantom pregnancy ended in failure, Ferdinand would spiral into black depressions that left the government frozen for weeks. In 1818, after 2 years trapped in that waking nightmare, Isabel finally found escape through the only door left open to royal women: death. The official cause was nervous exhaustion, but whispered letters from palace staff hinted at quieter, more deliberate acts of self-harm. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a soft prayer, thanking God for the freedom that lay ahead. Ferdinand's response to her death laid bare the madness festering within. He did not mourn. He raged. He convinced himself that Isabel had been murdered, a plot by unseen enemies, to stop him from producing an heir. And with that belief, his descent was no longer private. It became the kingdom's burden to carry. He demanded autopsies, not just one but several, each performed by different doctors, each searching desperately for traces of poison. Several of Isabel's ladies-in-waiting were thrown into cells, accused of plotting against the crown. The king's grief was inseparable from his madness, a swirling storm of rage and suspicion that pulled everyone around him into its orbit. Isabel's funeral became a nightmarish spectacle. Ferdinand insisted on seeing her body again and again, as it was prepared, touching the corpse, whispering bitter laments about the promise her womb had failed to fulfill. He had a death mask made, not for public remembrance, but to be displayed in his private chambers, where guests later claimed to see him, speaking softly to the lifeless face, as if expecting it to answer. Yet even this descent into madness could not delay the king's obsession. Before her grave had settled, his ministers were already seeking a third wife to carry his cursed legacy forward. Now came the hardest part, finding a royal bride willing to wed a man whose previous queens had met such grim, mysterious ends. Ferdinand's peculiar reputation had traveled faster than any envoy. Negotiations dragged on. Several princesses quietly withdrew after discreet consultations with Spanish court physicians. Others stayed in the running, but made rare demands: separate bedrooms, personal guards, and medical clauses written into the marriage contract. What once had been a private affliction was now a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Ferdinand's dysfunction was isolating Spain from the royal families of Europe. Finally, his agents struck a deal. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a German princess whose family's finances were in ruin. The Saxon court, desperate for stability, chose to overlook the whispers, the rumors, the fate of his last bride. Maria was 24 when she arrived in Madrid in 1819, older, more seasoned, but still clinging to the same doomed hope that had once sparkled in Isabel's eyes. The third wedding felt different, quieter, wearier. Ferdinand was aging, and the court had grown tired of these royal train wrecks. Few foreign dignitaries attended. The celebrations were muted, and the mood suggested a ritual, performed out of obligation, not hope. Maria Josepha approached the ordeal with a surgeon's calm. She was no naive bride. Her Saxon doctors had coordinated with Spanish court physicians, exchanging brutal insights. She arrived not just with gowns and jewels, but with a private physician and a chest of specialized tools, oils, restraints, tinctures, and instruments meant for the bedroom, not the throne room. Romance never entered the equation. Maria treated her royal duty like a medical experiment, one that required patience, precision, and a clinical detachment from the man she was expected to serve. As both queen and subject, Maria's clinical approach fared better than Isabel's doomed idealism, but it still couldn't solve the unsolvable. The third marriage settled into cold routine, scheduled acts of intimacy, planned with medical precision, carried out like surgeries, rather than anything resembling love. Maria Josepha kept meticulous logs, recording times, techniques, and outcomes like a lab technician. Her emotionless precision frustrated Ferdinand more than Isabel's raw fear ever had. He grew convinced Maria didn't see him as a husband, but as some specimen. Paranoia returned, sharper than ever. He feared she was documenting his every flaw for foreign agents. His spies confirmed. She exchanged letters with Saxon doctors. To Ferdinand, this was nothing short of espionage. Spain, meanwhile, was crumbling. One by one, the colonies fell. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, taking with them the gold and silver that had fed the empire for centuries. And Ferdinand? He was too consumed with his personal curse to even notice. Cabinet meetings were postponed. During one of Ferdinand's many breakdowns with his queen, affairs of state stalled for weeks, as the king buried himself in consultations with doctors, searching for the next miracle method to make a child. The Spanish people, once euphoric at his return, had begun to realize the price of restoration. Cities simmered with unrest, rural roads were ruled by bandits, and the poor went hungry, while their monarch poured treasures into imported physicians and custom-built devices. Spain had become a joke in Europe, its decline embodied by a king whose bedroom woes were no longer secret. But then, in 1829, after a decade of cold, clinical matrimony, Maria Josepha achieved the unthinkable. She was pregnant. The court erupted, Europe held its breath, and diplomats scrambled to explain the miracle. Some claimed it was divine mercy, others pointed to modern medicine. But in the dark corners of court, where truth whispered softly, there were rumors of betrayal, of another man, and a child that may not be royal at all. Ferdinand's reaction to the pregnancy was a volatile mix of joy and dread. He doubled the palace guard, summoned Europe's best physicians, and ordered Maria Josepha's rooms. Blessed by every priest, bishop, and holy man in Madrid, his obsession with protecting this fragile miracle soon crossed into mania. He became convinced that unseen enemies would strike through poison, sorcery, or science to rob him of his heir. At first, the pregnancy seemed routine, but in the 7th month, the queen began to bleed. Palace doctors were baffled. Today we know it as placental abruption, a dangerous but treatable condition. But in 1829, Ferdinand's meddling turned it fatal. He refused to trust modern physicians alone, insisting that mystics and alchemists be consulted too. Treatments clashed, protocols broke down, and the queen's condition worsened. In the chaos, on May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into early labor far too soon, and with far too much at stake. The delivery was a nightmare, etched into the memories of all who witnessed it. Ferdinand, despite knowing nothing of medicine, insisted on overseeing every moment. He barked orders, ignored doctors, and hovered over the queen. As chaos unfolded, the child, a daughter, was born frail and gasping, her life slipping away. Within hours, Maria Josepha survived the birth, but her strength faded quickly. 3 weeks later, she was gone. The doctors blamed childbed fever, but behind their language was a harsher truth, a mix of unchecked infection and a heart shattered beyond repair. Ferdinand's response to this final loss was not sorrow, it was collapse. The fragile barrier between obsession and madness shattered completely. He wouldn't let them be buried. Not yet. He ordered the physicians to keep trying, revive the mother, save the child, no matter how impossible. For nearly a week, the royal chambers reeked of death, as Ferdinand refused to face it. He paced, he shouted, he prayed to gods and ghosts, but medicine could not raise the dead. When reality finally pierced his madness, he broke. He stopped eating. He locked his doors. Advisors were turned away. The court whispered in fear, as their king wasted away, fixated on the waxen faces of the death masks he had ordered. For all 3 of his wives, Ferdinand had become his own shadow, drifting through a palace that now felt like a tomb. But fate, ever cruel, wasn't finished with him. That same year, 1829, at age 45, the king who had failed to produce a living heir was offered a 4th marriage. Ferdinand's advisors, frantic to restore stability to a crumbling kingdom, found him a new bride, Maria Cristina of Naples. What they didn't reveal, not until the ink had dried, was that Maria Cristina was already carrying another man's child. The 4th royal wedding, held in 1829, was a pageant of denial. The court watched in disbelief as a clearly pregnant bride glided down the aisle, her condition undeniable, her timing impossible. The child wasn't Ferdinand's, couldn't be, but the king, shattered by loss and maddened by hope, embraced the charade. He called it a miracle, a gift from heaven, and in his fractured mind, this was how Providence chose to reward his years of suffering through impossible, immaculate deception. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have been the crowning moment of Ferdinand's long, tortured quest for an heir, but instead, it unleashed a fresh wave of dread. He knew, deep down, without question, the child wasn't his. Yet the illusion of legitimacy had to be preserved at all costs. The dynasty depended on it, and so the royal lie was wrapped in ceremony. Ferdinand posed as the proud father, while whispers echoed through the palace halls. His bond with Maria Cristina was no longer romantic or even political. It was a fragile alliance, bound by secrets, sustained by necessity. Their marriage was a kingdom built on sand, and every royal smile hid the fear that it could all collapse. With a single, careless truth, she played her part, offering deference and duty, while he clung to the lie that her child was truly his. Ferdinand's final years were haunted by the same dysfunction that had plagued his entire life, but now the stakes were higher. He launched into one last desperate campaign to father a true heir with Maria Cristina. These pitiful efforts, monitored by the same exhausted doctors and skeptical specialists, grew more tragic as age made success not just unlikely but impossible. The paranoia that rotted his mind in those final years shocked even the most jaded courtiers. He began storming into his wife's chambers unannounced, armed guards at his back, shouting accusations and demanding confessions. These surprise raids, sometimes in the dead of night, left her attendants trembling. No one knew when the king might appear, wild-eyed and trembling, obsessed with betrayal and ghosts of bloodlines that had never truly existed. He had peepholes bored into the walls, that separated his chambers from Maria Christina's, and he would spend hours hunched in the shadows, spying on her like some deranged voyeur. Servants whispered about catching glimpses of the king's unblinking eye, fixed on his wife during her most intimate moments, as she nursed their child, as she whispered prayers, even as she sat alone in silence. Maria Christina, aware of his silent surveillance, began to move through her chambers, with the caution of a prisoner, every motion rehearsed, every expression restrained. Mealtimes turned into ceremonies of dread, a parade of suspicion wrapped in silver and steam. Ferdinand demanded that not only must every dish be tasted, but that tasters wait a full 30 minutes before serving to catch any slow-moving poison. He would watch them like a hawk, scanning for the slightest grimace, a cough, a flutter of the eye. Several collapsed from the stress, their fainting taken as proof of poison, not panic. And as the rituals grew longer, Maria Christina, caught in this tightening snare, began to display the same haunted stillness that had doomed the women who came before her. Her letters home, secret cries to Naples, never reached their destination. The king's spies intercepted each one, dissecting the pages for signs of disloyalty. But what they found was something darker, the unraveling of a mind. Maria Christina spoke of unseen eyes, watching her every move, of flinching at shadows, of doubting even the hands that served her tea. She called her existence a glass cage, where every breath was measured. For signs of disobedience, Ferdinand's paranoia was no longer confined to his wives. It swallowed the palace whole. He rotated his guards daily, convinced that familiarity bred betrayal. Even cabinet ministers weren't spared. He would whisper one thing in private, then its opposite to another, waiting to see who dared correct him. And if they did, that was all he needed to brand them, agents of treason. The Spanish court, once admired across Europe for its elegance and poise, had decayed into a theater of paranoia. Every corridor echoed with whispered code. Courtiers avoided eye contact, moved like diplomats in enemy territory, and mastered the art of saying nothing. Words could wound, but worse, they could be overheard. Alliances were built and broken on the suspicion of loyalty. One misstep meant exile, or a cell in the palace dungeon. Even the king's gaze became a weapon. Ferdinand's bond with his infant daughter Isabella was no comfort. Though he knew the child wasn't his, he clung to her as heir, while silently resenting the proof of his own failure. He would cradle her in silence for hours, his eyes scanning her face, desperate for any feature he could claim as his own, or suspect as someone else's. He ordered court painters to capture Isabella at every stage of infancy, then compared those portraits to old images of himself and known lovers of Maria Christina. The child's existence tormented Ferdinand, not for what she was, but for what she proved. She would inherit his crown, not because he had triumphed as a king or a man, but precisely because he had failed. This cruel irony, that his bloodline endured only through another man, gnawed at him like poison. He turned to genealogists and physicians, demanding scientific proof that could somehow bless the child as his. Those experts, fearing for their lives, crafted delicate, ambiguous reports, masterpieces of double meaning, designed to please a king who wanted certainty where none existed. As doubt consumed him, Ferdinand tightened his grip on Maria Christina. Spies were assigned to her letters, but not just the words. They were to observe her face as she wrote, noting every smile, sigh, or hesitation. No prayer, no page of her book, no passing word with a courtier escaped his scrutiny. It was no longer a marriage. It was a surveillance state, disguised in royal lace. Maria Christina's fight to maintain a facade of normalcy under such suffocating scrutiny demanded extraordinary psychological strength. She mastered the art of compartmentalization, offering the world a calm, regal presence, while privately enduring the relentless strain of living under constant observation. Centuries later, a hidden diary was discovered, tucked behind a false wall in her chamber. Its pages reveal the inner collapse of a woman, forced to perform her own life. "I feel like an actress," she wrote, "who must never break character, not even in my dreams." But Ferdinand's madness was no longer confined to the palace. His paranoia bled into international diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors began sending home alarming reports of a king ruled by fear, of a court unraveling from within. Marriage alliances faltered. Potential partners hesitated, doubting Spain's ability to maintain even the most basic commitments. Under such volatile leadership, Ferdinand's obsessions were no longer just personal tragedy. They were now matters of state. He began seeing assassination plots in the most mundane of acts: a delayed greeting, a dropped goblet, a cough at the wrong moment, each one, in his mind, a signal of conspiracy. When Maria Christina asked to redecorate her chambers, Ferdinand didn't see it as a matter of taste. He saw it as a threat. To him, new furnishings meant secret compartments, hiding places for poison or weapons or treasonous letters smuggled out at night, when courtiers offered polite compliments on the queen's appearance. Ferdinand suspected coded messages, secret signals passed in plain sight, even prayer became suspicious. Maria Christina's increased devotion, once seen as virtue, was now viewed by her husband as possible contact with foreign Catholic powers. No act, no expression, no word was safe from the king's unraveling mind, and the cost was devastating. While Spain's people starved, Ferdinand emptied the treasury on layers of protection against shadows. He poured fortunes into surveillance, loyalty investigations, and sprawling spy networks designed to watch those who already served him. He ordered the construction of secret tunnels through the royal palace, had complex alarm systems installed, and divided every role among multiple people, tasters, guards, maids, to ensure no group could plot together. The palace became a fortress of suspicion, and the kingdom paid the price. These mounting expenses bled Spain dry. Funds that could have relieved a crumbling economy were funneled instead into Ferdinand's obsessions, his labyrinth of spies, his fortress of fear. Meanwhile, the financial crisis deepened, and under the weight of it all, the king's body began to fail him. Palace physicians observed the signs. He rarely slept, suffered constant stomach pain, and was gripped by what they called nervous agitation. But they all knew the truth. He was being devoured by his own mind. His paranoia became a vicious cycle. Each fear sparked a new action, and each action created new reasons to be afraid. He was a man spiraling inward, trapped in a maze of his own design, and those closest to him, his few remaining family members, were pulled into the abyss. One by one, his personal relationships collapsed, sacrificed to the throne of suspicion he had built with his own trembling hands. He started seeing enemies in every embrace. Even among those closest to him, Ferdinand now saw betrayal lurking beneath smiles. Family gatherings, once simple, joyful affairs, turned into interrogations in disguise. At birthday celebrations, he scoured every detail. Were the flowers arranged with hidden meaning? Did a certain gift conceal a message from abroad? Not even his brother, Don Carlos, his most loyal supporter through years of crisis, escaped the king's growing web of suspicion. He too was watched. Maria Cristina, desperate to protect their daughter from the madness closing in, became a target herself. To Ferdinand, her maternal instincts looked like treason. Every request to spend time alone with Isabella was twisted in his mind, a chance to feed the girl dangerous ideas, planted by foreign powers. What should have been tender moments between mother and child became, in his eyes, acts of conspiracy. The palace servants were caught in a cruel trap, expected to spy, yet pretend loyalty. Many broke under the pressure, their nerves shattered by the impossible double life. Staff turnover soared, and each new face brought more risk. One wrong look, one misunderstood word, was enough to invite royal suspicion. And all the while, Ferdinand's obsession with uncovering Isabella's true father was descending into something darker and far more invasive. He ordered investigators to compile exhaustive dossiers on every man Maria Cristina had ever known in Naples. Every conversation, every fleeting interaction was scrutinized for clues. They compared facial features, searched for inherited traits that might link one of them to young Isabella. But Ferdinand didn't stop there. He demanded access to medical histories, family illnesses, even decades-old love letters, all in the hope of uncovering a name he could never speak aloud. His own chambers became a shrine to personal defeat. Portraits of his 3 dead wives lined the walls, alongside bizarre medical instruments designed to fix what his body could not. Religious relics sat in glass cases, each one once prayed over, in desperate hope of a miracle that never came. This was where he ruled from, not a throne room, but a mausoleum of failure. And yet here he held court, discussing laws and war, while surrounded by the quiet ghosts of his most private shame. The psychological strain on Maria Cristina deepened. As Ferdinand's behavior slid further into madness, the queen's body began to betray her, hair falling out in clumps, her weight fluctuating wildly, hands trembling as she tried to maintain composure. During public ceremonies, her ladies-in-waiting observed new nervous habits, glancing behind her constantly, flinching at the faintest sound, moving like someone forever expecting something terrible. Then, in 1832, Ferdinand's paranoia reached its most grotesque form. He became convinced that Maria Cristina was trying to poison him, not through food or drink, but through her touch. The king began demanding medical inspections before any physical contact with his wife, searching for traces of toxins he believed might seep through her skin. Court physicians, ordered to carry out these humiliating rituals in the king's presence, witnessed the final collapse of anything resembling a marriage. The world looked on, as Spain unraveled, a nation descending into madness, under the weight of a single man's fears. Foreign diplomats recorded their astonishment in letters, noting how European powers were quietly preparing for the inevitable collapse of Ferdinand's rule. They saw the truth, a kingdom held hostage by a king, no longer capable of rational leadership. Some nations began fueling separatist movements within Spain's borders, deciding that a fractured empire was less dangerous than one led by a paranoid monarch. And as 1833 arrived, Ferdinand's body began to mirror his mind. Court physicians observed his steady deterioration, a tremor that never left his hands, digestive pain that resisted every remedy, and the chilling onset of what looked like mental decline. His speeches turned into chaotic rambles, rambling tirades against shadowy enemies, and conspiracies born only in his mind. And in the end, after years of chaos and delusion, Ferdinand didn't explode, he faded. His body, worn down by a lifetime of battling both his flesh and his fears, simply began to shut down. In his final days, he drifted in and out of delirium, calling out to dead wives, barking commands to investigate plots that never existed. In 1833, Ferdinand II finally found peace, not through redemption, but through death. The official cause was listed as gout, but palace physicians quietly admitted what everyone already suspected. He had died of exhaustion, a complete collapse of body, mind, and spirit. After decades of impotence and paranoia, the secret autopsy that followed, conducted by the same doctors who had studied him like a specimen, unveiled the final cruelty of a man betrayed by his own body. The king's anatomy, preserved for medical study, measured a shocking 14 inches, its girth changing dramatically from base to tip, just as whispered accounts had always claimed. But more disturbing were the findings inside, internal scarring and deformities that made normal intimacy nearly impossible, explaining a lifetime of frustration and failure. Yet the autopsy unearthed something even darker, clear signs of deliberate self-harm, dating back to Ferdinand's teenage years. For decades, the king had secretly attempted makeshift surgeries on himself, desperate efforts to fix what nature had twisted. Using crude tools, he had only worsened his condition, layering trauma upon trauma, both physical and psychological. His preserved member, alongside anatomical drawings and chilling observations, was locked away in the Vatican, deemed too grotesque and politically explosive for public knowledge. It became one of history's most macabre state secrets. Scholars granted access call it both mesmerizing and horrifying, a glimpse into the torment of power, warped by bodily fate. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era, but the ruins he left behind lived on. Isabella II, the daughter who may never have truly been his, inherited a broken kingdom, civil war, economic collapse, and humiliation on the world stage. The once mighty Spanish Empire was now a shadow, its fall hastened by a man who prioritized obsession over leadership. Ferdinand's story stands as a brutal warning. Power without wisdom is dangerous, but power entangled with deep personal dysfunction is catastrophic. He showed how private shame can erupt into national trauma, how a monarch's hidden torment can scar an entire nation. In the end, his 3 dead wives, his haunted daughter, his fearful court, and his shattered realm were all casualties of a genetic curse, a lottery lost centuries earlier. Ferdinand was both the author and the victim of this tragedy, a man elevated to a throne he was never fit to sit upon. As his royal physician preserved that final relic, his grotesque anatomical legacy, he must have grasped the full irony. This was not just a medical oddity, but the physical embodiment of a failed reign. That organ, sealed in silence, was a monument to shame, a symbol of power corrupted, and a record of wasted potential. Ferdinand too achieved immortality, but not as a king of greatness. He became a cautionary tale, a name remembered, for the damage one man's body and mind could inflict on millions. His relic, hidden in Vatican shadows, reminds us that some truths are too disturbing to become legend, too human to be myth, too tragic to be forgotten. The silk sheets that once veiled his twisted form now symbolized a kingdom in ruin, just as incapable of functioning as the monarch who ruled it. Ferdinand too had finally found rest, but Spain would carry the burden of his reign. For generations, he died as he had lived, as a source of suffering to all who came too close.